In the quiet town of Crestwood, nestled between rolling hills and dense woods, I lived in an old two-story house. It was a charming place during the day, full of sunlight and memories. But when night fell, it took on a different character. One particular night, as the moon claimed the sky and cast long, eerie shadows, I found myself alone at home. The usual comforting silence of the house felt different, heavier. A vague sense of unease twisted in my gut as I settled in the living room with a book, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of dread. That's when I noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow flit across the hallway. It was darker than the surrounding gloom, its form humanoid but undefined. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to look, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was just my imagination, a product of being alone in an old house at night. I tried to refocus on my book, but my attention was tugged by the movement again. This time it was at the foot of the stairs, a dark figure that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight, rendering it pitch black. Fear coursed through my veins, a cold, icy sensation. I stood up, trying to convince myself to go and check, but as I approached, the figure vanished. The area where it stood moments ago was just an ordinary shadow once more. The rest of the night was a parade of these shadow people. They lurked in corners, darted across rooms, always in the periphery of my vision. Never outright confronting me, but their presence was a palpable weight, a silent threat. The house no longer felt like my own. It felt invaded, occupied by these shadowy entities. I could hear soft whispers, a language I couldn't understand, emanating from empty rooms. The temperature seemed to drop, filling the house with a bone-chilling cold. An oppressive dread hung in the air, turning the familiar into the unfamiliar. Sleep was a distant dream. I kept all the lights on, huddled in my living room, my eyes darting to every little movement. The night felt like an eternity, a relentless siege of fear. As dawn broke, the shadow people gradually disappeared, retreating into the unseen corners. The whispers faded, and the house warmed. But the echo of their presence lingered, a chilling memory imprinted on the house and me. From that night forward, the house was never the same. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every noise a potential whisper. The shadow people, although unseen during the day, were never truly gone. They were always there, lurking, waiting for nightfall to stake their claim, turning my sanctuary into a haunted playground. The old house on Maple Street was my haven, a charming relic nestled amongst towering oak trees. Its creaky floors and faded wallpaper were part of its charm, a testament to the many years it had stood. But one night, that charm turned into an eerie backdrop for an encounter that chilled me to my core. It was a night like any other. I was alone, playing World of Warcraft on the computer. But then, the peace was broken by a soft knock on the front door. Puzzled, I rose from my chair and went to investigate. Peering through the peephole, I saw them, children, or what seemed to be children, standing outside. They were draped in shadows, their features obscured, but their size and stature were unmistakably those of young ones. It was late, too late for any child to be out, and that was my first hint that something was amiss. Opening the door, I asked them what they wanted, but they didn't respond. They stood there silent, their faces hidden under the brims of their hoods. A shiver ran down my spine, a primal warning bell ringing in my mind. I was about to close the door when I noticed their shadows. They were wrong. The moonlight that should have shortened them instead elongated them, stretching and twisting unnaturally. I closed the door abruptly, my head ringing. I returned to my living room, but the image of the shadow children outside my door haunted me. I peered out of my window, and there they were, their eerie silhouettes stark against the moonlit yard. They didn't do anything, just stood there, their presence a menacing reminder of their unnaturalness. I could see them move slightly every now and then, their shadows dancing grotesquely on my lawn. A feeling of dread settled over the house like a shroud. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock sounded louder, each passing second echoing in the unnerving silence. The children didn't knock again, didn't call out, they just lurked, their very presence turning the peaceful night into a nightmare. As the night wore on, I kept all the lights on, my eyes darting to every little movement outside. The whispers of the wind sounded like faint giggles, the rustling leaves like hushed conversations. However, I kept on playing with the sound and gameplay of the game distracting me until morning. I was frozen for hours that night. To this day, I swear I can still see them in the woods from afar. My dad used to tell me stories about our neighbor, Mr. Harold. He was a historian, the kind of man who had a sparkle in his eyes when he talked about old times. I remember one story in particular that sent chills down my spine, a story about a cryptic diary and the so-called shadow people. Mr. Harold had found a diary from the early 19th century at an auction. The worn-out pages belonged to a man who claimed to be haunted by shadowy figures. As a historian, he was intrigued by this mysterious account of the past, and he started to study the diary closely. The diary was filled with strange symbols and written in an archaic language that was difficult to understand. But Mr. Harold was determined. He spent hours, days, weeks trying to decipher it, his curiosity piqued by the man's chilling accounts of the shadow people. But as he delved deeper into the diary, strange things started happening in his own home. He began to see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his rooms, disappearing when he tried to take a closer look. The very figures the diary's author had described. My dad said that Mr. Harold became obsessed with the diary. Every conversation he had, every waking moment was consumed by it. He believed that the diary held the key to understanding and getting rid of these shadow people. He started to look tired and worn out, the sparkle in his eyes replaced by a haunted look. I remember seeing him through our living room window, always with the diary, his face pale under the dim light. It was scary to think that our neighbor was living in fear of these shadow people, just like the man who wrote the diary 2 centuries ago. The story ended without a conclusion, Mr. Harold moving away one day without a word. We never knew if he managed to rid himself of the shadow people or if he was still haunted by them. It's been years since I heard this story, but it still gives me goosebumps. The idea of a cryptic diary and shadowy figures lurking around is the stuff of nightmares. The sun had just set as we pulled up to the imposing, dilapidated structure of the old asylum. The building was notorious in our circle, a hotbed of paranormal activity with a reputation for making even the most seasoned investigators question their sanity. The building loomed over us like a silent specter, its broken windows seeming to stare down at us like lifeless eyes. We started unloading the van, the routine task providing a small comfort against the eerie stillness that surrounded us. The usual banter among the team members was noticeably absent, replaced by a tangible tension. The only sounds were the clanging of our equipment and the distant hooting of an owl. Once we had set up our base in the former lobby, everything seemed normal, just another cold, decrepit building. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere within the asylum started to shift. A sudden, biting cold descended upon us, wrapping around us like a spectral shroud. I could see my breath in front of me, even though it was the middle of May. I was manning the infrared cameras when I first noticed them, shadowy figures darting in and out of the corners of the screen. I called over Mark, our tech expert, hoping it was just a glitch or a trick of the light, but his usual confident expression quickly turned into one of uncertainty as he too saw the shadowy apparitions on the screen. Then came the whispers, soft, chilling murmurs that seemed to echo through the empty corridors. Even with our state-of-the-art audio equipment, we couldn't make out what they were saying, but the unnerving tone of the voices sent chills down my spine. The strangest part of the night was the physical sensations. A brush against my arm when no one was nearby. A sudden pressure against my back as if someone was standing too close. A pull 2 halves on my hair when I was all alone. It was clear that something didn't want us there, and it was trying its hardest to make its presence known. Our equipment, usually reliable and precise, began to malfunction. Cameras would flicker or shut off entirely without warning, while our audio recorders would suddenly become filled with static. The electromagnetic field detectors, which we used to track paranormal activity, would spike erratically, indicating something was interacting with the energy in the room. By this point, the entire team was on edge, each of us experiencing our own inexplicable encounters with the unknown. As we gathered in the lobby to discuss our findings, we couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that filled the room. It felt as if the asylum itself was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We decided to press on, cautiously proceeding deeper into the bowels of the asylum. The paranormal activity intensified as we ventured further, the temperature continuing to drop, and the whispers growing louder and more insistent. It was then that we began to realize the asylum was not as abandoned as we initially thought. The spirits of those who had suffered within its walls seemed to cling to the very fabric of the building, their pain and torment manifesting as the shadowy figures and chilling whispers that plagued us throughout the night. It was as if the asylum itself was a living, breathing entity, its malevolent energy feeding off our fear and trepidation. Despite the overwhelming fear and unease that gripped us, we continued our investigation, driven by a determination to uncover the truth and bring some measure of peace to the lost souls trapped within the asylum. But we couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking a fine line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, and that the asylum's dark secrets were not meant to be revealed. My grandma's house was always full of old, mysterious things. She owned an antique store, you see, and her house was like a treasure trove of trinkets and baubles from days long past. I used to love exploring her house, each room filled with a sense of intrigue and adventure. One day a man came into Grandma's store. I was there, helping her dust off the old wooden shelves. He was a young man, but his eyes were old, like he'd seen too much. He wandered around the store, his fingers brushing against the dusty antiques, before stopping in front of a dark, old painting. It was a strange painting, one that had always given me the creeps. It showed a Victorian street bathed in heavy rain. The street was deserted except for the elongated humanoid shadows that seemed to lurk in the corners. I remember asking Grandma about it once, and she had simply smiled and said, "Every painting tells a story, dear. This one's just a bit more mysterious." The man bought the painting and left. Grandma said it was a good sale, but I couldn't help but feel a bit relieved that the creepy painting was finally gone. A few weeks later, the man returned. He looked different this time, his face paler, and his eyes had lost their spark. He said he had started seeing shadowy figures in his house, figures that looked just like the ones in the painting. They appeared more frequently, he said, and with each sighting they seemed to come a bit closer. I remember the look on Grandma's face. She was calm, but I saw a flash of worry in her eyes. She offered to take the painting back, and the man accepted, never to return again. I remember my grandmother setting fire to the painting, putting an end to whatever kind of evil was trapped within.